looked or no? Do you know?
He's a teacher. I don't know.
Right. I don't know which. Yeah, but which? But the question is, what is it? Not everybody. There's different types. There's different hashkafot.
You should look at his curriculum.
Yeah, he has books, right? I don't think I ever read any of his
books.
Even
on the internet. I sent you his name of his yeshiva.
Okay.
And
I have to
so pick a
check
subject
it out.
next week. Next week is Rosh Hashanah. Maybe the day after.
Oh, you're learning with him every week now.
Yeah.
Nice.
He's telling me next week. So okay.
All right. Okay, we are on page 259. We are on page 259. We are on the third line. Last week we talked about a lot of things. Last week we basically answered the second form of the question that we have with regards to how can God relate to a limited world, which has to do with the idea of how is it that the tzimtzum, how is it that the contraction is itself not a contradiction to God's perfect unchanging nature, because he contracts himself to have a low expression of himself, which becomes the world of Atzilus, which is the Sfirot, the 10 spheres, which is what's affected by our actions here in this world. And the question becomes, so how is this tzimtzum itself not a contradiction to his knowing the world? And the explanation was very succinctly that tzimtzum loy kapshuta. The tzimtzum has no real reality to it either. Its reality is like the ray of the sun within the sun. The tzimtzum is only real as an expression of his unchanging nature. And from his perspective, there really is no tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is only really from our perspective, or in more precisely, the tzimtzum is what allows our perspective to exist. It's what creates our perspective, the perspective that there is anything that exists separate from God. And therefore, the tzimtzum, the idea that the tzimtzum itself, the contracting of his light, really affects him or really changes him is not true, because the tzimtzum is not literal. The tzimtzum doesn't really change anything. The tzimtzum allows there to be a reality that thinks that it's separate from him. But really nothing is separate from him. From his perspective, there is no change in the tzimtzum whatsoever. When we say nothing is separate from him, we mean nothing is not an expression of godliness. That's what we mean. I should be clear. We're not saying that everything is God. God forbid. Some people misunderstand the notion. The idea that everything is God is not a Jewish idea at all. You have to go to the Far East for that sort of
it's pantheism.
For that sort of thing, or pantheism. Pantheism in English.
Pantheism.
Right.
So in Hebrew, pantheism.
Right. Pantheism. Pantheism is the belief that everything is God.
That's the third.
That the universe is God. Basically, the universe itself is God, and God is the universe.
And that's all. It's like nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's the definition of the universe under that definition. The universe is literally everything, right?
So they only learn like first grade, they didn't go to second grade.
That's all. Everything they say that everything is literally God, which is not what we say at all. Okay. Page for many reasons that are not worth going into here. Okay. We're on the second line of page 259. Page 2, the end of the chapter is actually on a sort of a different topic, but not unrelated. So, and it's a nice little piece. And the Mirza Hashem today we'll finish the chapter, God willing, if we can. Okay, third line on page 259. So he just says at the beginning here, so we have explained the second question in one way as we explained it, and the question was, how is it possible for him to be affected, because from whom will he be affected, right? And the answer is ki yachol v'yacholhu. He is able and he is able. He translates it here. There's the possibility for such an arousal for him to be affected, because we're speaking about the godly light that shines after the tzimtzum. In other words, there's basically two levels of godliness. The answer to the question of how can God be affected is he's not affected, godliness is affected. And if you want to say that the existence of godliness itself is a contradiction, the tzimtzum is like kapshuta. That's basically the answer, the short version. That's the answer to the question. Yachol ve'yacholhu. He is able, there's him, and then there's his godliness. Okay. We could also ask this question in a slightly different way. This is sort of the third way of asking the question, or it depends how you count it. This is the second way of asking the question. whatever. This is the second way of asking, because the second way that I said before, he seems to really view as more of just a deeper way of asking the first question. This is a second way of asking the question. Why would he contract himself to be affected by the world? It's a different way of asking the question. Not how, so to speak, mechanically. In other words, he is contracting himself as a contradiction to his simplicity, right? Or he's supposed to not be affected, so how can he contract himself? That was the first way of asking the question. The second way of asking the question is different. Why would he contract himself, right? It would have been very good if he ruled over the world through his great and through his infinite light, which is above the contracted ray, to do good to everyone. In other words, why does there have to be a tzimtzum at all? Right? As we've explained before, right? God, as he is above the tzimtzum, is totally without limitations. When we refer to the God who knows everything, and the God who is infinitely powerful, the God who can do anything, this is all referring to God and his expression before the tzimtzum, before he contracts himself. So if he's perfectly omnipotent and perfectly omniscient, and he can do anything, why does he even have to make a tzimtzum at all? Let him just create a world and be unaffected. In other words, it's not a contradiction for God. Why should there be a tzimtzum? Why should there even be a tzimtzum? Let him create the world from his infinitude. A slightly different way you could say it maybe is why is it so important to him to be affected? Why does he want to be affected by the creation? Why does he bother to create the world in such a way that he's affected? He should create it in a way that he's not affected. He could just do it from his infinitude. We're on page 259, the last line. But the truth is, says the Tzemach Tzedek, this is not really a question. It's not really a question. It's not a question at all. Why not? Because we already explained in chapter 6. If it were not for the tzimtzum, if it were not for the holding back of the godly light, the worlds would not be created at all as they are in a finite sense. Why? Because as we've explained before, what is the contraction? What is the tzimtzum? He is withholding his reality from the world. From the world is really inaccurate because the world is created from the withholding. But it's very hard to speak about it in the way in which he does it, where the world is created through the tzimtzum. So I'll just say that he's withholding his reality from the world. Really, he's withholding himself so that the possibility of an objective reality can arise. Is really a more accurate description. He's withholding his reality. He's withholding his presence. If God's light were everywhere without a tzimtzum, everywhere would perfectly reflect and perfectly convey his reality. It would convey his existence perfectly. What the tzimtzum allows there to be is something which does not convey his reality. And when we say convey his reality, we don't just mean the idea that there is a God. What's conveyed by the light, by his expression, is everything that he is, right? The truth of his infinitude. In other words, it's not just I can also know that there is a God. A human being can know that, as we've said in the first chapter of this discourse, where 1,000 years ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. We talked about how knowledge is knowledge that he exists, rather than what he exists. If that rings any distant bells for anyone. But anyone can know that God exists, but what his light is not just the knowledge that he exists, but it's the expression of everything that he is. It's the true infinite expression of God in his omnipotence, in his omniscience, and all of these things. And therefore, there is no room, so to speak, intellectual room. There is no spiritual room where that godly light is, where that infinite light is, for anything else to exist, for the limited worlds to exist as they are. Because the limitation, why the limited world specifically? Because the limitation implies a separateness from God. The limitation implies that the God is not fully expressed here. If it's limitation, then obviously God in his true infinitude is not expressed there. Right? Unless you have good arguments of tzimtzum shalei kapshuta, which is that God is fully expressed everywhere. That's what we spoke about last week, which is a different idea. It's still not God is expressed in a way where everything is profoundly aware of his existence everywhere. It's just, he's expressed through his concealment, which is kind of a deep idea. But the point is that in the simple understanding, just at the simple level, where his light is, he is known, and not just he is known about, but he is known, his presence is there fully. The place where his light is, so to speak, is a full expression of godliness. And so for there to be a world which can even perceive itself as being separate from God, that light has to be limited. Just as the tzimtzum is necessary to create the world, so it is necessary for God's light to control the worlds. In other words, to relate to the worlds in a limited way, just as the worlds are created in a limited way, so too does God relate to them in a limited way. In other words, if God were to express himself fully in his relationship with the world would simply cease to be. So he creates it and he deals with it. He deals with the world at a level of limitation. So that's one answer. In other words, very simply, the answer, why would God bother contracting himself? Because the goal is to, in Chassidus, it's a bit backwards. The goal, in the sense of normally we talk about what God needs to do, and the world is an afterthought. Chassidus says it's the opposite, because the highest thing we can say about God is that he desires to dwell in a world where he's completely concealed. That's the highest desire of God that we can even recognize in any way. That's given to us in the Torah. So the very idea that God wants this world where he's completely concealed necessitates that there should be a tzimtzum, necessitates that he should have to contract himself, because if in his infinite expression, the world as it is now, with his concealment and as he's hidden within it, is not really possible. Furthermore, if the tzimtzum, if the contraction of God's light did not take place, we would not reach the ultimate reward, we will not reach the ultimate goal and the reception and the receiving of reward. Al yidei askam b'Torah and mitzvahs, through performing Torah and mitzvahs. The goal of Torah and mitzvahs and the reward of Torah and mitzvahs are both accomplished through the tzimtzum. Why? Ma'achen shaloi haya enesh klal, because there would be no punishment whatsoever. As is written in the Zayar, which says, Huda Atika, this is Atik. Ilamalidina lo yishtachach ba'alma. If there were no judgment, if there were no din, if there were no severity in the world, men would not know the higher faith. They would not labor in Torah study, and they would not fulfill the commands of the Torah.
That's what he said, the Bechira.
In other words, yeah, it's connected to Bechira for sure. Let's do a couple of footnotes here. Footnote 25. The inner dimension, when it says this is Atik, so we're talking about a Kabbalistic level. Let's explain what that is first. Footnote 25 says the inner dimension of Keser. The Zohar is emphasizing the fusion of judgment and kindness, which the inner dimension of Keser brings about, is fundamental to the world being elevated to its perfect state. In Keser, in Atik, there's two levels. Okay, so let's do what time is it? Let's do a Keser, we have time. Let's do a Keser primer. What's Keser? Keser, literally translated, means crown, right? You have 10 spheres. You have, which ones are the 10 spheres is actually a matter of some controversy, but in the typical formulation, we say the 10 spheres are Chachma Bina Das, which is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. That those are the three intellectual traits. Then you have 6 emotive qualities, also known as Za, or Zer Anpin, which literally translates to the small faces. Don't ask me why. We have Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, which is kindness, severity, and mercy or beauty, as it's often translated. We'll maybe get a little more to Tiferes a little later in this chapter. You also have Netzach, Hed, and Yesod, which is victory, acknowledgement or subjugation, and foundation. Those are the 3 lower emotional qualities. And then finally you have the 10th sphere, which is Malchus. Malchus is the connective sphere, which conveys the higher spheres to the lower spheres. Malchus has nothing of its own, but only gives over to the other. Malchus is compared to speech. Right? All the other spheres are what you have in your mind and your emotions, and Malchus is to convey it outward. That's what Malchus is. Above, the 10 spheres, however, are not the highest functions within the soul. The 10 spheres do not represent the highest. These are both. Pardon me. Let me say first. These 10 spheres are both God's mode of expression and also the 10 functions or the 10 faculties of the soul as God created it. Because God created man. This is what it means that God created man in His own image. That the soul is created reflective of God's spheres, which He uses to create the world. And both in the soul and in the godly expression, the spheres are not the highest thing. Before the spheres, you have Keser. Keser is like the opposite of Malchus. What Malchus exists only to give over, Keser exists to receive from what's higher. That's what Keser is. And Keser, the qualities of Keser, are not like the 10 spheres, which are all what are called Koiches Pnimiyim, which means the inner powers. Keser is the Koiches Makifim, the surrounding power. What's the difference between the inner powers and the surrounding powers? The 10 faculties of the soul are like organs. They exist, they are specific abilities of the soul. Just like the body has parts, and the different parts of the body are used to achieve different things, and you can't pick up things with your eyes and you can't see things with your hands, right? So too, each of the 10 spheres are defined. They have a defined purpose within the framework of man, and you need all 10 to be complete. But beyond the individual, just like beyond the body, you have a person who is not defined by any one part of the body. You have a person, you have a soul, you have an individual who is not part of the body, who is not the body, but the body is merely their tool. The body is the individual organs of the body are what they use to express themselves, but they themselves exist entirely within their body, right? They are just as they are in their hand, they are in their leg, and they are in their eye. All of the person lives within the entire body. So too, to the 10 spheres, you have higher things, because the 10 spheres are also just faculties at the end of the day. They may be very defining faculties of the person. The person is defined by their emotions and their intellect. But nevertheless, the person is not limited to their emotions and their intellect. There are unified powers, which are not single organs, which are not single faculties, in which the person is found even more. So, beyond the 10 spheres, beyond the 10 faculties, at the very core of the person, you have the etzem haneshama, you have the essence of the soul. And mediating between the essence of the person and the essence of the soul, which is basically the person themselves, and their faculties, you have 2 powers, which are both included in Keser, they're both included in the crown. The 2 powers of the person that are the most expressive of the soul, that do not express themselves in a specific inner way, like organs. They're not individual faculties that express in a single way, but rather they are pure expressions of the person as a whole. These 2 things are what are called the inner and outer Keser. And the inner Keser is called Atik, the outer Keser is called Arich. Literal translations. The inner Keser, the inner crown, the inner power, is called the Ancient of Days, the Atik Yomin, literally translated. And the external one is called the Arich Anpin, which means the long faces. The long faces. As opposed to Zer Anpin, which is the small faces, these are the long faces, okay? Those are the literal translations. But what are they? In the soul of man, you have the inner Keser and the outer Keser. The inner, in other words, the deeper and higher power, is Tainug, is pleasure. Loosely translated, I think pleasure is not an excellent translation, but it'll have to do. You have Ratzon, which is will, or desire, which is the outer aspect of Keser. And pleasure and desire are obviously, demonstrably things that are not limited to any one koyach. They're not limited to any one faculty of the soul. For example, a person feels that they have pleasure from their thoughts, or from their emotions, and the pleasure that they get is not a thought pleasure or an emotion pleasure, but rather it connects to the person themselves. The person is satisfied. A person gets satisfaction through their intellect or through their emotions or through any of the other powers of the soul. These are not specifically limited to those powers, but rather the soul itself has the ability to feel satisfied. The soul itself has the ability basically to withdraw within itself. It doesn't need that, to not need anything more, which is basically what Tainug is. Then you have Chitzonius HaKeser, the outer aspect of Keser, which is desire or will. And a person, we know from being human beings, from our own experience, that the will affects all part of you equally. In other words, the will to think something and the will to move your hand are not 2 separate expressions of will. Each one is me, I desire to do something, and it happens. I desire to think or I desire to move my hand. Even though the action of the hand is the lowest ability of the soul, it's koach maisa, it's not even part of the soul itself, it's not even part of the spheres, but is only a garment or an external ability of the soul. And thinking is the deepest of the internal powers of the soul, assuming we're talking about Chachma and Bina rather than Machshava, which is a whole different story. But the will is equal. The will affects each of them equally. It's not like it takes more time for the message to go to my external or lower faculties than to my inner faculties. And this demonstrates that the will of the soul is actually not an individual faculty, but is rather a soul power. It's an attachment. Ratzon and tainug, in a sense, are the attachment and the detachment. Will and pleasure are the attachment and the detachment of the soul from things. It's the soul is there, or the soul removes itself from it as a whole, as a simple. It's either on or off. It's a digital switch. There's no gradations, because it's an expression of the whole soul. Okay, so that's the primer on Keser. That's what it is in the soul. Within the godly world, you also have Keser, which comes before the world of Atzilus. You have the expression of Arech Anpin, and you have the expression of Atik Yomin, which are again roughly understood as Ratzon and Tainug, God's will and God's pleasure. Now, what we're saying here is that Atik, which is God's pleasure, which is the deepest part of Keser, in other words, it is the deepest expression of godliness, basically. Their severity and kindness are so to speak, united. They're fused. They're not separate. And if there were no judgment found in the world, then people would not have a higher faith, and they wouldn't work to fulfill the Torah and to fulfill the mitzvahs. In other words, the tzimtzum, which is severity, the tzimtzum, which is limitation of self, allows people to fulfill their purpose in this world. The tzimtzum allows there to be the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. Allows there to be a fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs, and for man to achieve his purpose in this world, and also to receive reward, as is mentioned by the Tzemach Tzedek. It was about this. Well, we're going to explain this more, what this means. Pardon me, Malach HaMavas, pardon me. What's the verse? We have the verse here in the English, from Bereshit 131. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So Bereshit, the sages say, good refers to the angel of life, and very good refers to the angel of death. Is that interesting? Yeah. So God saw, right, that everything, he said everything was very good. Tov ma'od. Good, most days it says good, but I think Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, it says very good. It says good twice, pardon me. But then it also says Tov ma'od. It says very good. On the sixth day, pardon me. Yom Shishi. It says Tov ma'od. It says very good. So why does it say very good on that day? Because on that day he created the angel of life, which is good, and he created the angel of death, which is very good. That's what the Medrash says. In other words, the angel of death also representing severity, tzimtzum, the contraction of God's expression, because God himself is life, etc.
Do you have an explanation for that? Why is the angel of death very good?
Because, as we're saying here, it's only the tzimtzum which allows there to be the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. In other words, this whole idea that there should be beings that are separate from God with free choice, as you were bringing up before, who choose to fulfill Torah and mitzvahs, which the emphasis is not really on the choice. The emphasis is on the choice is almost an outcome. The emphasis is on that they shouldn't be compelled. That God is hidden from them. If God is hidden from you, the choice arises almost naturally, right? Because God desires to be expressed in the lowest place. So therefore, how do you get the lowest place? You conceal yourself entirely, and only then can the highest and the greatest good that's possible within the creation be achieved, which is the fulfillment of the Torah and mitzvahs in this world. But basically, he's saying the angel of death. We're saying here just the angel of death as part of the idea of severity, or part of the idea of tzimtzum. That it's because this world is so far from God and God is so concealed here that we're able to fulfill the greatest good and fulfill the purpose of everything, which is to fulfill Torah and
the angel
mitzvahs.
of life or the angel of death more good, or it says very
very good, better?
Because the angel, I'll tell you why, because the angel of life could exist without the so to speak, the human condition of God in a concealed world. The angel of life, God is life in Chassidus. What is life? Life is God himself. Everything that lives by power of God. As opposed to death is God's concealment. The idea that something can cease to be is itself a concealment of God. In a way, it's actually a very high revelation of God. Also, that's not what we're saying here. That's a slightly different idea, which is in a sense a deeper idea, but that's a whole other thing. We could be here all night talking about that. But here, what we're saying in a much simpler sense is that if the angel of life can exist without a world where God is concealed. The idea that God gives life to everything and there's intermediaries, that angels can exist as intermediaries to give life to other things, that could exist in its highest expression. The creation of the world could end at or Ein Sof, or Atzilus, or Bria, or something like that, in one of the higher spiritual worlds, and there could still be angels of life.
When you say the angel of life, that's specifically about man.
No, I don't know. I don't think so. As far as I understand, I'm giving you my interpretation here, but I think this is what it means. As opposed to the angel of death, where the angel of death belongs to this world where he's concealed, and it's this world where he's concealed. That's the highest. That's the ultimate goal of the universe.
But behind that, because if the soul goes back to its origin, then it's very good.
Then why should the soul be born in the first place?
That's why the ultimate Gvura actually is Tchiyat HaMetim.
Pardon?
The ultimate Gvura is Tchiyat HaMetim.
Right. Yeah, in some sense, I suppose. Yeah, but the person wouldn't be born. The person wouldn't be born in the first place, right?
No, if the mission. If you fulfill the mission, then you deserve. The good thing.
That's not what we're saying. We don't say that the very good thing is death. God forbid. That's not what we're saying.
What we're saying. Obviously, we wish to live as long as possible and as good as possible.
Here's where the confusion is. The confusion is according to the Kabbalistic understanding of Judaism. The truth is not even Kabbalistic. According to Judaism, where the soul ascends to Gan Eden and the soul has this experience of God and has immense pleasure and reward in the world to come, doesn't that mean that true life is after death? That's the real question. The real question is, why do we even call it death? The soul ascends to higher life. Right? We should say, because the soul has an experience of God there. It's in a higher state. It doesn't have all the limitations it has when it's in this world.
The death of the body.
Yeah, the death. Who cares? It's the body. What's the body? The body's meat and bones. So.
But that's
what it says. Not what I say. It's what the Talmud says. It says the body is what's found in the meat pots. It says something like that. The meat pot's like a cholent. The body's like a pot of stew. That's all the body is. What's the body?
Yeah, but there's stuff you can't do up there that you can do. Yeah.
That's the point. The point is that it's not. The point is that death is death and life is life. It may be that in death you have a higher experience of God, but the higher experience of God is not life. The higher experience of God is not life. The true life is not experiencing God as a being separate from God. True life is fulfilling God's will, which is the highest way of attaching to God. This is really the doctrine of mitzvahs, which is the doctrine of mitzvahs in Chassidus is
that's the purpose.
The doctrine of mitzvahs in Chassidus is to is to fulfill the will of God within the world. And the will of God is the true attachment to God. In other words, that's what God most deeply needs, that's what God most deeply desires. The fact that you can, as a being, appreciate God in a higher world, or in Gan Eden, or in the Garden of Eden, or things like this, in a sense, that's not true life. In a sense, that's not the true goal. The true goal is to fulfill Torah and mitzvahs within the world. That's the ultimate goal, and that's what true life is. And to do that, you need a tzimtzum. To do that, you have to have a world. And therefore, the angel of death is very good, whereas the angel of life is only good. I think that's what we're saying here. As is known. As is known, and there's no need to speak at greater length about things that are revealed and known in the words of the sages. In other words, obviously it says it in the Midrash, so you obviously understand it, no more need to discuss it here. Okay.
That's funny.
V'hinei, al pi mashinis bar le'el, yuvan hetev ha-midrash. According to what we said before, we will understand well the Midrash, the very famous Midrash. The Midrash goes like this. Emes amar, the truth said, right? God is deliberating among his qualities, among his traits. It says in the Midrash, before he creates the world. And he's asking them, should I create the world or shouldn't I? It's very famous Midrash. God asks truth, should I create the world? Emes Amar, truth says, Al Yivra, do not create the world, God. The truth itself told God, don't create the world. Why? Shekuloi malei shkarim. The whole world is full of liars. The world of lies. The truth's opinion is that the world shouldn't be created. There's no need. What?
Well, that does imply there's some sort of time, otherwise how could you ask the question?
The Medrash is not to be understood as God is actually speaking to someone who's actually giving him answers. I don't know how it is to be understood, but I can tell you how it's not to. I can tell you how it's not to be understood. There's no being of emes that God was not speaking to someone and consulting about the creation of the world. The world hadn't been created yet. Right? That's not the point.
No, but maybe the Malachim.
Why? Why do you have to say Malachim? It's not. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is the Midrash is true. We don't necessarily understand the way that it's true, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. Right? We have the Medrash. The Medrash says, the truth says that the world is not to be created. You can understand this, you could say you understand it allegorically if you want, as long as what you mean is that it's not that it didn't happen, but rather that it did. Right? Normally when you say allegory, it means that it didn't happen. The Medrash did happen. What it means, I don't know, but it happened. Right? That's the point. That's the point. That's how a Jew reads a Medrash, right? But the idea that just because when it says truth says, that means that there's something I'm imagining that truth is, and it was speaking to God. No, what I imagine is not necessary. All that's necessary is the Medrash. And the Medrash says, truth says to God, don't create the world because the world is full of liars. As opposed to chesed, kindness. Chesed Eimer, the kindness says, Yivra, create the world. Why? Shekuloi malei chasadim, because it is full of kindness. Very interesting, no? Well, the truth says the world is full of liars, doesn't work for me. Kindness says, create the world, it's full of kindness. So, which itself is very interesting and should inspire further thought, because the world really is so full of kindness. You think the same way the world is full of lies, it's full of cruelty, right? Chesed says the world is full of kindness, which is an indication that it doesn't really mean necessarily in the way you think at first glance. The world is kindness in the way we normally think. We don't mean it's all roses and everyone's just giving charity all day long. That's not necessarily what we mean. Although perhaps that's what it does mean. I'm not limiting it one way or the other. I'm just saying it's interesting. It's interesting that you would say the world is full of liars, but it's also full of kindness. Maybe the lies are what makes it kind. It's an interesting medrash, right? How does Tzemach Tzedek explain it? Oh, sorry, pardon me. I don't think we're done with the Medrash yet. I don't know if this is part of the Medrash or not. Pardon me. Okay, there's a footnote here. Okay, they themselves don't know whether it's part of the Medrash or it's not really part of the Medrash, but they put it in here. Okay. This is what it says. The world is built on kindness. The world is built on kindness. This is the verse that supports this medrash. The world was built on kindness. That kindness says that the world should be built. Okay, that's the medrash. But we have to understand. First of all, which is interesting, because that's Tzemach Tzedek's first question. My first question is the world really kind? Tzemach Tzedek has no problem with that. Tzemach Tzedek seems to say, okay, the world is kind. What's Tzemach Tzedek's question? Tzemach Tzedek's question is you're saying that kindness is not true? God's kindness is not true? You say Chesed has no problem with lies, apparently. How's that possible? You're contrasting God's truth with God's kindness. How can that be? God's kindness isn't true? It's a lie, God forbid. Certainly God's kindness would not say the opposite from what's true. Right? Truth, it says God's signature is truth. God's seal is truth. Everything about God is what defines truth. If that's the case, how can it be that God's kindness tells him that I don't mind the lies? The lies don't matter to me. Create the world anyway. It's kind, even though it's full of lies. So God's kindness has something to do with lies. God forbid. We also have to understand we also have to understand what is this trait of truth, which is one of the 13 attributes of mercy. What is its nature? In other words, asking on the other side now, is his truth not kindness? The first question is his kindness not true? How can you say his kindness is accepting of lies? Secondly, how is it that his truth is not kindness? Truth is part of the Yud Midas Arachamim, is part of the 13 attributes of mercy, is its truth. So how can it be that truth is unkind? Truth doesn't care. Truth is truth, so to speak, is not on the same side as kindness. Are the other attributes of mercy not true? God forbid. Are all the other of the 13 attributes not true? These are the questions. Understand the questions? Remember, we're going to understand this according to what we've learned in this chapter so far. And basically, through understanding the tzimtzum, we're going to answer these questions about God's truth and God's kindness. Acha Inyan. Rather, the idea is, top of page 263. We already spoke at length. It's already spoken about at length in the holy books. Shepirish milas emes lo yemer ela lav yisbarech levad. The definition of truth applies only to God alone, which we don't say about everything, by the way. But only God Himself is really true. This is the Rambam himself says this at the very beginning of the Mishnah Torah. The first law in the Rambam's book of all of Jewish law says that God is true. Nothing else is as true as God. The truth of everything is derivative of God's truth. Only God is really true. Kamasha Kasim, as the verse says, "V'Hashem Elokim Emes." Hashem, your God, is true. Mipnei, why? Why is truth? Why are truth and God uniquely related? Mipnei shehu yisbarich mechuyav hametzias, because He is the mechuyav hametzias. He is what is called the necessary being. God is the only thing which must exist. Everything else can exist. Everything else has a derivative existence. Everything else is created. God is uncreated. God exists by definition, so just more or less. There's different ways of understanding what that means. Some of them are more involved, and some of them are less involved. The bottom line is that God, by being what it means to be God, is that He exists. There's no possibility for God to not exist. God is the only thing that must exist, and everything else is derivative of His existence. Everything else gets its existence from God. He was, is, and will be. This is the second aspect of this description, that His being is from His own, His existence comes from His own essence. His being comes from His essence. Meaning what? Meaning that for everything else, its definition does not say that it exists, right? This is very famous. This is philosophical. This goes back thousands of years. The cup, you can define what a cup is without ever having to say that a cup exists, right? In fact, we have imaginary things that we all know what it is quite well. Like, for example, a unicorn, you can define what a unicorn is. That doesn't mean that one of them ever had to exist, right? You have things, and so too anything that does exist. You have a cup. You could go and destroy every cup in the world. You would still have the notion of a cup. You would still have what it means to be a cup, but you wouldn't actually have any cups in actual existence. In other words, the definition of things, what it means to be that thing, does not necessitate that such a thing should actually exist, except for one thing: God. God Himself, by definition, by knowing what God is, part of Him, part of what He is that He is. God is again the only thing which is like this. Everything else there's this distinction. In God there is no such distinction.
Because He exists only in the definition.
Pardon?
He exists on the definition.
What do you mean?
But this is not something that we can describe. Other than we describe just by the definition of it.
It doesn't have to do with how we describe it. It's the logical necessity. It's the logical necessity. If you follow all of the logic to its conclusion, like the Rambam, for example, the Rambam's proof of God's existence, what you reach is a being who has no distinction. You reach a being that's simple, and the simplicity entails that there's no difference between what it is to be and what it is to be defined. In other words, he's not a member of a species. His essence and his being are united. There's no such type of thing that you can be that's God that does not exist. There is only God, and He exists. There's no type of thing to be that's God. It's part of His. Yeah.
If you look at the beginning, something has to exist, because without that thing, nothing else would come.
Correct.
So this thing is actually God.
Correct. And that thing which has to exist, as part of the logic of understanding what that thing must be, we understand that it exists by definition.
It's like what came first, the chicken or the egg. So I think it's written someplace that among the things that God created, He actually created the tzvat. Why? Because with the tzvat, you can actually put things in the fire and create something out of that. Otherwise, it couldn't happen.
Yeah, so God is the necessary first existence, and by being the definition of God, God by definition exists. He exists by definition as opposed to everything else. V'haya hova v'yiyah, and He was, is, and will be. He exists beyond time entirely. Mash'ein kein b'chol hanimtzayim, as opposed to with all of the creations, she'ein lehem metzias mitzad atzmon, who have no existence on their own. They have no existence They have no inherent existence. They have only borrowed existence. They exist because God makes them exist. Ella mitziyusam tali b'yizbarich. They depend. Their existence depends on Him. May He be blessed. L'hainu alidei chayas shemeir mashpia behem mizeim chayamim, through the life which He shines and endows them with. They therefore exist. Im kain ein mechusam anira aleinu amiti klal. And if so, their being, which they show to us, their essence, which we perceive, is not true at all. What the truth of their existence is really the godly life which makes them be. As we learn in Chassidus, the true definition of something is not sufficient what makes something, as we were just saying, the definition of something doesn't make it exist, right? The truth is, what I'm about to say applies even to the definitions themselves, which you have to understand. But what actually makes the thing exist is not its definition, but rather the godly power that's invested within it. And the truth is, by definition, everything is defined in terms of godliness, in truth. If it weren't for the tzimtzum, and if it weren't for all the concealment of God, we would see it. We would see how the cup, in its definition, is defined as something which God creates it. It has no independent definition. That the mind perceives the cup as a being and feels that it can fully describe the cup as existing merely independently of God is actually a limitation of the intellect. That is actually the intellect not perceiving the truth, which is a whole other. There's a difference between reason and truth, which is a very deep idea. I've actually been learning a little bit more about it recently. But the bottom line is that the fact that we perceive the essence of everything to be defined in any way without God, the fact that you could reach the end of the dictionary definition of the thing and not have brought God into the definition in any way is a limitation of the intellect. The fact that anything can be defined not in terms of God. In truth, if we could see the truth, we would see that everything is defined in terms of God, and therefore, what everything is not a full description of anything except God. So, in other words, there is no description you can give of anything except God Himself that's actually 100% true. In and of itself. There is because everything is not complete in and of itself, right? You understand? You understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying is, if you were to describe everything about this cup, you describe it in every way possible, you give me all the information about it's lacking. It's not true. It's not true. Even if you say the cup comes from God, ultimately all that means is you have to bring God into the full definition, right? You have to bring God into the description. The cup, as the cup, cannot be truly described at all, which is a very deep idea. Right, the cup as the cup, because it doesn't exist independently, cannot be truly defined independently. The only thing which its essence conveys exactly what it is God, and therefore God is uniquely true. God is true, unlike anything else is true, because His existence comes from Himself. Because He's not defined in terms of anything else, God has a truth which nothing else has. God is uniquely true. Everything else is not true. Truth, by the way, being generally speaking, when we say the truth is in God Himself, we also say in Chassidus that truth means consistency, which ultimately refers to God Himself, because the only thing which is truly consistent is God Himself. In other words, true means that it holds at every level. And God is the only thing which holds at every level. That's another little idea here. So what's the bottom line of all of this? The bottom line of all of this is that what is truth? Truth is God Himself. Only God is really true. And according to what we explained before, I'm on the first line of page 262. According to what we explained before, truth refers to God's perspective as He sees everything before the tzimtzum. Truth is how everything is before God, before the tzimtzum. Meaning everything is in front of God before the tzimtzum. The kula kalei chashivim, that everything is of no significance. That's the truth. In other words, if God is the only thing which is really true, then the only really true perspective, so to speak, The only consistent perspective is that of God himself, which, as we've been describing, is perspective before the Tzimtzum, is perspective from above the Tzimtzum, so to speak, the Das Elyon. The higher perspective is that everything does not exist. Everything is of no relevance. Everything is of no importance to him. Everything is as it doesn't exist. Nothing has a separate name at all. It's all part of God from God's perspective. That's the truth. The truth, in the highest sense, is from God's higher perspective for the Tzimtzum. Before God created things that were untrue, so to speak, before he limited the truth and allowed something that was a lie to exist, before he did that, everything before him was as nothing.
So this is the objective truth, and what we see is subjective truth?
No. The opposite, actually, almost. Right? Because God is a subject, not an object. Right? In a sense. What we see is more objective. In a way, I wouldn't split it subjective versus objective. That's not how I would split it. I've mentioned subject
of truth.
No, well, yes, yeah. Obviously, there's truth at every level. The truth is, it depends. Relative. It's relative. It depends what you mean. Right? It depends what you mean by truth. It depends what you mean. But the ultimate definition of truth, God's truth, as it were, God's truth is before the Tzimtzum. That's what we're saying. That's how we're going to make sense of this medrash. God's truth is before the Tzimtzum. God's truth, meaning to say that the perspective of him who is defined by his own existence, of he who needs nothing else to exist, before him everything is nothing. Because from his perspective, from that level of truth, everything else that exists only as a lie, basically. In other words, by that standard of truth, everything that exists that does not exist by itself, but rather has to be created by God, is a lie. And therefore, everything is a lie, except for God himself. And that's the perspective of Kula Kamei Kalei Chashuv, that everything before him is as nothing. Everything is only an expression of himself. Nothing is as he and everything else exist in a totally separate realms in every way. There's no. And you say, he did the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is like a pshuta. That's what we said last week, right? That Kula Kamei Kalei Chashuv is possible because the Tzimtzum doesn't affect it. The Tzimtzum is another thing that's just Kula Kamei Kalei Chashuv. Everything is part of his expression. Everything is to him is as nothing. So that's the true perspective. When we say God's truth in the highest definition is there is God and everything before him is as nothing, as we explained last week. V'lechein Amar. Therefore, the truth said, Al Yivra, do not create, Shekulay Malei Shkarim, because the whole world is full of falsehood. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that people are lying in the world, right? That's not what it means. It doesn't mean there's liars in the world. There's
a lot.
Sha'elam nira liyesh v'davar, because the world appears to be an independent and existent reality. Ube'emes shezeh sheker kanal, and from the perspective of truth, that's a lie. From the perspective of God's truth, that's a lie. That the world exists independently of God.
So there's no life before death.
What?
There's no life before death. This is what it says here.
Why? You have to explain this.
שכולו מלא שקרים שהעולם נראה ליש ודבר, ובאמת שזה שקר. It means we don't exist. That's what it says here.
No, we exist in a way of sheker. We exist. God forbid to say we don't exist. We exist in a way of sheker. We exist in a way that's inconsistent. We see things differently from the highest truth, which is not it's not a chiddush to say. Obviously, we see things differently.
But it's like, everything is black and white. There's no gray, because we are actually gray.
What is black and white?
If God is truth and God is white,
yeah,
and everything else is like black.
Yes,
nothing in between.
Absolutely. From the higher perspective, that's exactly what we're saying. Yeah, exactly. Nothing else can approach. God is categorically different, which is why, by the way, I'll slip this in here as a party favor in case someday somebody comes across this talk of the Rebbe's, that this is why the Rebbe reads the first halacha in the Rambam, where it says that God is the first existence. He says this can't be literally talking about God himself as the first existence. This is God as he lowers himself to create the world, because the first existence implies he exists first, and then there's a second, and then there's a third. There's some sort of connection between them. But God himself, as the ultimate necessary being, is not like that, which is why the Rebbe has a whole Chassidic reading of the first few halachas in the Rambam, which is totally crazy, which is totally, it turns everything on its head, and it's literally mind-blowing. So the Rebbe there explains that the first existence cannot be the necessary. They're not the same. The first existence and the necessary being are not the same thing. And in fact, he explains how the Rambam himself is said that. Even in the Moreh Nevuchim, even in the Rambam's philosophy, the Rambam implied that, which is a crazy thing. whatever. That's all the parentheses. So God's existence is not first, in other words. God's existence is, there's God, and then everything else is a lie. In a sense, that's true. In a sense, that is true. From the Das Elyon, from the higher perspective, that's what we've been saying. That the Tzimtzum is not Kipshutai. The Tzimtzum doesn't have an independent reality. The Tzimtzum is only, the contraction of his light is itself only a further expression of him. And within that expression, everything else exists. And all it is further, when he looks at it, all these things is further godliness. Is a further expression of his infinite self. And none of that is as true as God himself is. From the higher perspective, that is from the Das Elyon, from God's higher perspective, for the Tzimtzum, so when we read the Medrash, what's it saying? When truth said the world should not be created, we mean that from the higher perspective, when God is, so to speak, when God is aware and expressing his own truth, the world doesn't deserve to be created, because from that perspective, the world is just a lie.
Actually, it's very interesting because we read it in this book and it says, Bereshit bara Elohim.
Yeah.
So the question is, who is God? Bereshit or Elohim? It could be that Bereshit was the name of God, and he created Elohim.
Right. That's why they switched it when they translated the Septuagint. Yeah. So what does he say?
Then it says, we need to continue, but obviously it's God who created them
Right.
and everything. Right. And the fact that, he was before, he is, and he will be. So he's beyond time, and that's like the purpose. Right,
so the Rebbe actually famously says that the reason why it says Bereshis is the first, it's the whole thing. That's also a very nice talk from the Rebbe. The Rebbe says the whole reason why, because when the 70 sages, the Septuagint, right, is the Greek translation of the Tanakh, right? The 70 sages were hired, I think, by King Ptolemy, if I'm not misremembering, to translate the Torah into Greek. And very famously, they were separated into 70 different chambers, and they all made the same changes to the translation as recorded in the Gemara, so as for various reasons, so as to allay misinterpretation and to all these things, and not to insult the king or whatever. And miraculously, they all made the same changes. That's why it's called the Septuagint. Sept means 70, right? The Septuagint is the translation of the 70 sages into Greek. So that was the first translation of the Tanakh, which, by the way, the Gemara, it says, was an occasion of great tragedy. That's also something to look into. It's very interesting. It says it was like the day there was the golden calf, and then there was the day the Torah was translated into Greek, were two of the two tragedies in the history of the Jewish people. You can go figure out there in the Gemara. That's also a whole thing. But so when they translated it, instead of translating Bereshis bar Elokim, they translated Elokim bara Bereshis, right? Bereshis bar Elokim can be translated, the beginning created God, as Eyal just said, and so they didn't want there to be a misinterpretation, to be interpreted for idol worship, so they switched it, so it's Elokim bara Bereshis, God created, rather than God created in the beginning. So they switched the word so that the literal translation was more clear, that God created in the beginning. So the Rebbe famously says in a Sikha that the actual Torah of the Jewish people starts with the letter Beis.
Did you say the beginning created God?
Yeah. That's the way it says in Hebrew.
Bereshis bara Elokim. The literal translation, word for word, in that order, into English, would be, in the beginning created God. Which doesn't make sense itself, which is why it's a mishagas. It's not a literal. You couldn't even translate it that way because the grammar would be all wrong. But it doesn't matter. Okay, they switched it for the translations. The question is why. So Rebbe explains that in the way the Torah actually is, it begins with the letter Beis. It begins with the second letter. The way the way it was switched for the non-Jews was that the Aleph should be first. Why? Because the Torah, as it's given to the Jewish people, even the Torah starts only at the second letter. Even the Torah starts only at the second letter. There's God and everything else. The Torah itself is also only second. Aleph, the first letter is beyond even the Torah. And for the Jews, that's always important to remember. As opposed to for the non-Jews who would be studying the Torah not for its religious value to the Jewish people, but would be studying the Torah as a work to be understood in human intellect anyway. So the idea was that it's by Hashgacha Pratis, by divine providence, the letters were switched so that it would start with Aleph. In other words, if you're not learning Torah to connect to God, as was originally intended, and you're only learning it within human intellect, so then the Torah starts at Aleph. In other words, the Torah and God become separate then. How are the Torah and God united? When the Torah starts with the letter Beis, and God is above the whole Torah. It's this beautiful sikha from the Rebbe, explaining and he explains that according to all the different midrashim, which talk about all the different reasons why the Torah starts with Beis. There's a whole bunch of reasons, right? It says because Aleph is for Oror and Beis is for Baruch, right? And then it also says that it's created with the Beis because the three sides of the world were complete, but one side of the world was left incomplete. There's all these midrashim, and the Rebbe shows why all the midrashim are very strange. Then he gives this explanation, and then he shows how this explanation explains all of those midrashim. It's a beautiful sikha. You go and find that Bereshis is coming up. It's this parsha that's coming up. We should go and we should all Google it. Okay, let's see if we can race through the end of this. Okay, so that's why truth said, I got totally distracted. That's why the truth says that the world doesn't deserve to be created, because from the higher perspective of truth, everything else is lies. Okay, 3 lines up from the bottom of page 262. But kindness, however, exists after the tzimtzum. Truth, we don't attribute to, truth we only attribute to God himself. But kindness is an expression, right? Kindness is one of the spheres. Chesed is one of the spheres. And in the lower perspective, in the Das Tachton, in the perspective of the godly expression, in the perspective of the spheres, there it's possible for the worlds that they do exist. It's possible because the worlds there are relevant, right? That's how we said. That's how the righteous and the wicked are able to affect God, because at this lower level of godly expression, there he is able to be affected. Those lower expressions were created for the purpose of the world. Right? That's where kindness is. That's where what God's kindness exists for. So to that, the world is relevant. Pardon?
So kindness is an activity, is an act.
Yeah, more than truth. Yes, correct.
Okay.
Even
but acting truthfully is also an act.
There's different types of truth. There's different types. When he's reading truth here as the ultimate truth. As opposed to kindness, there isn't really, God is not identified with the ultimate kindness as he is as much with the ultimate truth, at least in the rabbinic writings. There's no truth. It says truth is the signature of God. Truth is uniquely godly. It's his. Truth belongs to him. Kindness is already something you do, something, an outward expression. The truth is that there's also kindness in the spheres. Tiferes, which I said we'd mention later, Tiferes is the sphere associated with kindness. The mediating, what we translate normally as beauty or compassion or mercy, is associated also with truth, which is very interesting. And the reason why it's associated with truth is because Tiferes reflects that highest truth most accurately. We can't do it now. There's no time for it. But Tiferes of all the spheres expresses that truth which only God himself has, even within the world. That thing which only God has, how is it expressed within the worlds? It's expressed within the worlds through Tiferes. So Tiferes is there's a lower truth as well, which is dependent and most clearly expresses that higher truth. Not for now. So there's other things. In other words, the idea that that's the only truth is obviously not true. Right? There's other truths, there's different perspectives. When we say truth as in God's truth, himself, the highest truth, we understand why that truth wouldn't want the world to exist, as opposed to, one second, at the end. Questions, as opposed to kindness, which kindness wanted the world to be created. Amar shekulam melech hasadim, because he said the whole world is full of kindnesses. Because to kindness, the world, the arousal from below, the actions of the world are relevant to God's kindness. Okay, so that's why kindness said that the world should be that the world should be created, and truth said it shouldn't be created. Okay, now further explanation.
Truth said it should not be created.
Correct, because it's full of lies. In other words, from truth, when we speak of truth, truth goes higher than kindness. Truth is really ultimately of the higher perspective, das elyon. Kindness is of das tachton, is of the lower godly perspective, and therefore it fits beautifully, because from the higher perspective, the world is a lie. From the lower perspective, the world is relevant, and that's what interacts with godliness. Right? That's where God is intimately involved and cares and responds to everything that happens within the world. So too, this is the second. So too, with regards to the truth of the 13 attributes of mercy, which we're actually now in a time of mercy. We're in Elul, and then Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These are when the 13 attributes of mercy are shining. So it's very appropriate that we should be finishing this chapter now. That the truth is one of the 13 attributes of mercy. This refers to the 2 mounds of the cheeks. It's right here. Right, very famously in Chassidus and in Kabbalah, the 13 attributes of God's mercy correspond to the 13 points of the beard. Don't ask questions. It's the beard which expresses the 13 attributes of God's mercy. That's why Kabbalistically you don't shave, as opposed to the issues in Jewish law, which are resolved in various different ways by various different people. But from the Kabbalistic perspective, you're not supposed to shave because the beard is the vessel for God's mercy.
Tikunei dikna.
Yeah, the Yud Gimel Tikunei Dikna, the 13 points of the beard. So the emes, the truth, is the cheeks, is the mounds of the cheeks where no hair grows, right? Which is important. Shumakam Panim Misaris, it's a place.
If you're Persian, it doesn't work like that.
No comment. Which is a place which is devoid of, I can make a joke, but that's how you tell whether a person's truthful or not. That's a different story. That's the place that's missing hair. Because truth is the revelation of God's infinitude beyond all contractions, beyond all limitations. So which is the Kabbalistic meaning of hair. Hair is connected to tzimtzumim. Again, please don't ask questions, there's no time. Hair is connected to the tzimtzum in general. Hair, tzimtzum, and severity are all related. So when God's truth, which is above, and as we just said, above any tzimtzumim and above all contractions, God's truth itself is expressed therefore in the cheeks, which are devoid of hair, because the hair it comes from the tzimtzum. Masha'en ken yud gimel. I know this is a lot of Kabbalah to drop on you at once. Masha'en ken yud beis midas hanisharim hem b'chinas taharis. Supposedly, the remaining 12 attributes, which are not truth, they all are of the tzimtzumim. All the other parts of the beard have hair. Shehu b'chinas hatzimtzumim, which come from the tzimtzum, God, the contraction of God. Liyas chesed v'rachum, to be kind and merciful, etc. As explained elsewhere at great length. On the verse, these are the journeys of Bnei Yisrael, and Moshe wrote. So in other words, just as we see in the Medrash with regarding truth and kindness, that truth and kindness are from two different realms, that kindness comes from the lower perspective, and truth comes from the higher perspective, where the entire world is a lie, from which the higher world is a lie, so too in the 13 attributes of mercy, we see two divisions. You have truth and the other 12. And that's why truth, and the way the 13 attributes are laid out on the beard, and yes, if you actually learn the Sefer Kabbalah, it talks about all the 13 parts of the beard and how they each correspond to each one of the 13 different attributes of mercy. And truth corresponds to the cheeks where no hair grows, because it's trying to say that truth is different than the other 12, because it too comes from a place above tzimtzumim. Tzimtzumim are represented by the hair. Yoyin sham. See there. Okay, let's do the synopsis. So basically, at the end of the chapter here, we just had a couple more ideas that are explained by this das elyon, das tachton, the before the tzimtzum, and the godly expression after the tzimtzum dichotomy, different ways of looking at that and understanding that, and understanding these different things. Synopsis. In this section, the Tzemach Tzedek focuses on a further difficulty raised by the philosophers. Even after it has been explained the emotional activity described in the Torah does not involve any change in God's essence, the question still remains. If everything comes from God, what could possibly motivate him to emotional activity? What could cause him to be happy or angry? People respond emotionally when affected by other persons to whom they can relate. Their feelings are aroused by situations around them. Can such statements be made about God? Nothing exists outside of him. Who or what then could possibly call forth an emotional response from him? In resolution, it can be explained as follows. In his essence, there is no activity at all. He is not angered and does not rejoice. Instead, he is exalted far above all these qualities. On this level, neither our mitzvahs nor our transgressions are significant at all. They do not cause him to be affected by them, and there is no concept of emotional arousal. Nevertheless, the ray of godliness that shines from him after the tzimtzum has descended to the level where it is affected by man's actions. Since the spheres come into being as a result of an awesome tzimtzum, an awesome contraction of God's light, it is possible that the deeds of the righteous and the wicked will elicit happiness and anger respectively. For on this lower level of godliness, the created beings are significant. Nevertheless, this explanation is problematic. For the spheres were not created as independent beings as the other elements of creation. They are emanations from his essence and still united with it. Hence, just as moral conduct creates an emotional response in his essence, one might think it would not generate emotional response within the spheres as well. Right? How could you say that lower perspective is not a change in God? The Tzemach Tzedek resolves this difficulty with an analogy of a father who desires to train a small child to act in a given manner and offers positive or negative reinforcement by showing different emotions. The father is not really angry or happy during this process. He's only using these responses for the son's benefit so that he will learn to perform the particular task. Similarly, in the analog, the created beings are of no significance in relation to God's essence. Nevertheless, he chooses to involve himself with them in response to their conduct. The Tzemach Tzedek also raises the question, why is it necessary for him to undergo tzimtzum in order to be aroused by the deeds of the created beings? Seemingly, it would have been preferable for him to control his world through his great light that transcends the limited ray enclosed within the world. In resolution, he states that, as explained in section 6, without his light undergoing tzimtzum, the worlds would not be able to come into existence in the limited state they're in now. Just as the tzimtzum is necessary to bring them into being, so too it is necessary to maintain their existence. That's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9, God willing, I guess next week we won't have a class. But the week after, God willing, before Yom Kippur is the next Shabbos, so God willing, the next week afterwards there will be a class, and we'll start chapter 9. We're 2/3 of the way through. There's 12 chapters. We finished 8 of them. Chapter 9 will begin with a discussion, a very interesting topic. We talk about how it is, whether it is, and if it is, then how is it that God's will can change? God's ratzon. God's will. That's the beginning of the next chapter.
These chapters are short.
With 8 was short. We discussed that for maybe.
There have been weeks.
Yeah.
Well,
weeks on this.